Welcome to our next Psychological Health Talk. Today we're going to talk about embracing a healthy identity. But I'd like to start by telling you a story. The story actually comes from Tolstoy. It's about a story about a Russian monk, turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, walking along a path. As he's walking along a path, he comes to a bridge. And the bridge is guarded by a very young, very nervous, very inexperienced soldier who unshoulders his gun, he lowers his rifle, points it at the monk, and he hollers to him, "Stop! Who are you? Where are you going? And why are you going there?" The monk stops, he kind of smiles, and he says, "I have a question for you first. How much do they pay you to guard this bridge?" The young soldier is kind of bewildered, but he responds and he says, "Well, they pay me 3 rupees a week." And the monk says, "I'll tell you what, I'll pay you twice that if every day you will stop me and ask me those same 3 questions. Who are you? Where are you going? And why are you going there?" This is the essence of what we mean when we say that someone needs to establish an identity. Now, the truth is that we in our lives have multiple identities. You probably have an identity as a male or a female, or perhaps some other way of looking at how you describe your gender. You maybe have an identity as a parent, as a teenager, as a worker, as a partner in a committed relationship. There's multiple identities that we have, and in fact, this is something that over the centuries there's been a lot of discussion. So we have from the extreme Buddhist perspective, and there's some interesting features of this, who would say there's really no self. The identity that we have is actually an illusion, and there's reasons for that. To other positions that say our entire life is built on trying to identify who we really are and being true to who we really are. In fact, there's a quote from Dolly Parton that I've always kind of been interested in. She said, "My job is to find out who I am and to do it intentionally." So there's this wide variety of looks at what it means to have an identity, what it means to know who we are. And part of the reason that that's difficult is that who we are, the identity that we have, actually changes depending on the circumstances that we're in. So if I'm playing on a baseball team, my identity might be to belong to that team, to play my position. Perhaps I'm a first baseman. And so during that time, that becomes my identity. At another time, when I'm with my romantic partner, my identity might be to be a part of this couple, to be engaged with this individual in such a way that my identity is fused in some ways with this other individual. Our world is actually quite complex. And as a result, we have different identities that surface at different times. And that allows us to function in a variety of different settings. That's one of the problems with trying to design and validate a personality inventory. So if we measure a person's personality, it actually turns out to be much more difficult than it seems, because how we act changes depending on the circumstances that we're in. So we might see ourselves in a particular way while I'm sitting down looking at the questions on a personality inventory and trying to answer who I am, and might be entirely different if I'm out with my friends on an evening of being at a restaurant and enjoying time with them, and who I am in that setting might change. So the challenge for all of us is to find an identity. It's important because in a complex world, having a kind of a rigid sense of who we are becomes very difficult in order for us to be able to make appropriate decisions. And so here's one of the problems. So let's suppose that I decide that I want to become healthier. And I've decided that the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to lose weight. And in losing weight, I'm going to count calories, and I'm going to pay attention to making sure that I don't overeat. And so that becomes my goal. Well, that becomes then a difficult thing because there are so many different places where I have to make decisions. And so I might then choose to become so rigid in counting calories that I lose weight in an unhealthy way because I'm just trying to lose weight. And as a result, I'm not getting the nutrition that I need, or I'm not maintaining the energy that I need. And so that confined, very rigid kind of sense of who I am becomes a hindrance rather than a help to my overall goal of being healthy. But in another situation, let's suppose that I want to adopt a healthy identity, but in this situation, I'm with my young children, or in my case, grandchildren, or maybe even great-grandchildren, and they want to stop at a fast food joint and get some food. Well, now, which of my identities is going to be the most important identity for me in that situation? Is it as a parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent? Is it as a healthy individual? How do I make those decisions? As I think about what my identity is, I will then begin to make choices out of that identity. I talked about this in one of our earlier talks, but when I was with a CEO for a large wellness group, that CEO was telling me that he believed that you had to create the right incentives and the right penalties to get people to make healthy choices. And I respectfully disagreed with him. I said that people want to be healthy in general. Most people would like a healthy identity. But there are many other roles, many other identities that compete with that. If I am a busy parent with a full-time job, a house to take care of, a spouse to respond to, children to take care of, that's very difficult for me to make the healthy choice of getting 30 minutes of exercise when kids need my time. I've got work responsibilities. I need to determine what is the best way for me to spend my time. the identities that we have help us to smooth that out. So if I see myself as healthy, I might then find myself able to choose, well, I can't go and do 30 minutes of uninterrupted exercise, but I can do this extra thing. I can take the extra time to play with the kids outside instead of watching them while they're on their electronic devices. We can throw the ball around, we can run around a little bit. I'm getting some exercise. I'm also being a responsible parent. I'm taking time to make their lives more enjoyable, helping them to appreciate what it means to move and exercise and play in a healthy way, and all of that comes out of my healthy experience. So how do we get the identities that we have? That leads us to something that's actually pretty important in psychological development. That is that we identify ourselves through stories that we tell about ourselves. Now, these stories emerge in our lives very early. So the first stories that we adopt about ourselves are actually not our stories. They're stories that others tell about us. Our parents or other adults will tell us about what we were like when we were very young. And that becomes a kind of the kernel of a story about us. So, for example, part of my story that I learned very early on was that when I was born, my mother and I had an incompatibility in the Rh factor. This is a situation in which when that interaction occurs, the baby becomes what they call a blue baby. And when I was born, that happened to me, and they had to do a transfusion in order to save my life. As it turns out, I'm old enough that the way to treat being a blue baby was only discovered a few years before I was born. So if I had been born 10 years earlier, I wouldn't have survived. But because they knew what to do, they were able to transfuse me, and I was fine. But along with that, my parents, who were Catholic, had me baptized, and the particular individual who was the chaplain at the time had also been a missionary, so he had the ability to not only baptize but also confirm, which is something that is pretty unusual for a baby in the Catholic faith. But that became part of my story, that I was baptized and confirmed on the day I was born, which happened to be Christmas Day. So that was something that I grew up with, and it became part of my identity. Not because I chose it, but because that was the story that was told about the way that I was brought into the world. There are many other kinds of stories that fashion and form how we view the world. If you go to get some psychotherapy, it's very likely that at some point in that psychotherapy, the therapist is going to ask you about your childhood and ask you about what that was like. And one of the things that you will do is you will tell some of the stories that you were told about what you were like when you were very young. That story becomes a filter through which you see the world. So if you were told by your parents that you were a very active, very busy child, you will begin to see yourself through that lens. If instead your parents tell you that you were someone who was always interested in learning and reading and things like that, that becomes your lens. And many of the choices that we make later on in our lives are based on those early stories. as it turns out, those early stories then are part of the formula by which we begin to develop. And if we take this developmental point of view, the next thing that happens is that somewhere right around the beginning of puberty, early adolescence, we begin to acquire the capacity not only to act out the stories that others tell about us, but to begin to formulate what we want our own story to be. Some of the rebellion that we see in adolescence is the drive in an adolescent to change the story about themselves and make it their own story. So there's some rejection, usually temporary, of the stories that adolescent was told when they were growing up, which feels like a rejection of their family and their family history, in order for that individual to say, I don't want to be defined by your stories. I want to create my own story. I want to be my own person. Now, normally what happens in that process is that the adolescent has some time in which they separate from their childhood stories, develop a different identity about themselves, and then reincorporate that childhood experience, the family traditions, the experiences that they've had, but now in a different format because it has become who they are instead of a story that's just told to them by someone else. That's a normal process and an important part of the developmental process. So that as I grew up and began to look at who I am, one of the things that I chose that I wanted to be was an individual who was very interested in other people's stories. And it happened to me in kind of an odd way. I was a quiet child, pretty introverted, and I didn't like really talking much about myself. But I figured out when I was an adolescent that other people often did like talking about themselves. And if I asked them questions and was interested in their stories, they liked being around me because they liked that I was a good listener, which weirdly enough translated into I was a good conversationalist. Even though I wasn't really telling them much about myself, I was just asking them to tell me about themselves. Now you can see how that identity then set the groundwork for me eventually becoming a psychologist and spending a large portion of many of my days asking people to tell me about themselves and being really interested in it. I still enjoy it. I really am fascinated to learn about people's stories and how they came to be the way that they are and how they're managing the difficulties that they have in their life and what drives them and causes them to be really good at who they are and really good at what they do. That became part of my story in my adolescence, and it laid the groundwork for me being able to be effective in the work that I do as a psychologist. Those stories help to define who we are. Now, they also do something else. So the stories turn out not to be random. What they do is they highlight certain aspects of who we are, and they eliminate certain other things that don't fit the story. So if there's a time, and there certainly are times when I do tell stories about myself, I just did that, and it doesn't fit the story that I developed when I was an adolescent. And so as I began to think of myself as good at getting information about other people, I began to minimize the part of my life where I was talking about myself and focusing more on the part of my life where I was getting information about other people. Simple principle of behavior is that we get better at what we practice. So asking people about themselves and listening to them and getting them to tell me about themselves became something that I became more and more practiced at. And talking about myself, I became less practiced at because it didn't fit my story. Now that has implications because if I have a healthy identity, then I am much more likely to practice those things that match that identity. I'm more likely to take the stairs instead of the elevator if I have a choice. I'm more likely to pick something up and carry it rather than find a way to get somebody else to do it because I see myself as a healthy person. I'm more likely to learn to enjoy healthier foods because that's my identity. And so that identity begins to shape who I become. It not only identifies who I am, it's not only a description, but it begins to shape and form who I become. That happens in a kind of an interesting way. So one of the things that we know about our brains is that they do a variety of tasks, but one of the things that they do really well is our brains actually are prediction mechanisms. They predict what's going to happen next and select the behavior that we're going to choose based on that prediction. That prediction is based on what our previous experiences have been, along with trying to fashion that previous experience to match the stories that we tell about ourselves. So when we look at one of the problems we have if we have been exposed to a trauma, someone hurts us in a fight. Part of what happens is that our brain says, okay, I'm going to remember that, and I'm going to use that as a prediction when I'm with that person the next time. And the prediction is going to be that I have to be very careful about that person because they could hurt me again. Now, perhaps that person just had a bad day and it wasn't about us at all, and they aren't actually at risk to hurt us again. But our prediction mechanism is such that we are protecting ourselves by saying, the last time I was with that person, they hurt me, so I have to be extra cautious about them. And that matches the story that I'm telling about myself, that I need to be careful and protect myself because they're not the only one that's hurt me. This person has hurt me and this person has hurt me. And so I have to be cautious about that. Well, that begins to shape who I am, and it shapes the kind of relationship that I'll have with that person because I am actively making choices based on those predictions. If I were to make a different prediction, that they just had a single bad day and I don't need to be worried about them, I would have a different experience of them. Well, it turns out that we have a similar kind of situation that happens. So in our health system today, one of the things that's happened is that we've started to look at our health responsibilities as primarily following a doctor's orders. And I don't want to diminish the expertise of doctors, of other medical professionals, of psychotherapists. I think that it's very important that we have access to that information. But one of the things that can do is it can cause us to have an identity as a person who is needing treatment rather than a person who is healthy. So if I have a diagnosis, and I don't have this diagnosis, but I'm going to use it as an example. If I have a diagnosis of diabetes, I might say, I'm a diabetic. Now that's going to shape how I make choices. And that might be different choices than if I were to say, I'm a healthy person who has diabetes. Now I can see that my identity is more complex. And I can start to shape myself based on that identity rather than accepting an identity that's thrust upon me. So when we're looking at making healthier decisions, one of the things that we want to be able to do is be aware that at any particular time, the story that I tell myself and the predictions that I'm making need to be updated. Let me say that again, need to be updated based on my current experience. Because what I was before isn't necessarily who I am right now. And one of the things that we get stuck in is in having an inflexible story that causes us to get stuck and miss opportunities. But if instead I can say, okay, so I was hurt by that person, we've resolved our issues, and now we're in a better place. I have updated my prediction. And now I have the opportunity to expand who I am based on my current experience, in addition to being aware of the things that I have experienced in the past. And that allows me the flexibility to continue to grow, to continue to change, to continue to make my life the kind of life that I really want it to be. So the Russian monk reminds us that it is very important that on a daily basis I can ask myself, who am I? Where am I going? Why am I going there? And continually update my story so that my identity is healthy, flexible, and leads me to be able to continue to grow. Next week, we're going to talk about some of the opportunities that we have to grow by looking at what the possibilities are for health and how you can identify where you have strengths and how to capitalize on those strengths. So you'll be able to watch this on our YouTube channel. Please take the time to watch all of our sessions and tune in each week for a new psychological health talk. Thanks.